So I am going to share my screen and give it some time to pick up the closed captioning. And while I do, it would be really helpful if everybody could make sure that you have a piece of paper, just like it could be just a scrap. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. It could be as small as a Post-it note. So have a piece of paper and a writing utensil near you. So if you need to get up and go, as long as you're wearing pants, feel free to do that or turn off your camera. And I am going to get this queued up. Well, that just kicked me out when I tried to share my screen. So I'm back. Can you guys, am I back with you guys?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Successfully?
Martina, it might be a good idea to turn off your camera so it's
Sorry
not trying to
about
send
that.
multiple signals. That's honestly why I usually leave my camera
Okay,
off.
thank you. All right, let me see what I can do here. I am going to get back to my Zoom window. As many Zoom meetings as we've all had to do, that this would be second nature by now. Okay, so now I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. All right, so while this is queuing up, you guys are all getting a piece of paper and a writing utensil. Like I said, it can be as small as a sticky note or as big as a full piece of paper. And today, there we go. Today we're going to be talking about the interpretive mode. And the interpretive mode is my favorite mode to talk about because it is the start of everything when it comes to language acquisition. So first, I just want you to take a minute to clear your head a little bit. If you're anything like me, you probably just wrestled a few tigers trying to get to your computer on time. And so just take a minute to calm yourself and think, when you think about the interpretive mode, what are you thinking about? So what does the interpretive mode mean to you? What does that look like in your classroom when you're in your classroom? What are you doing? What are your students doing? What resources are you using? What activities?
Hey,
See, are my
Martina?
captions going or no, they're not?
Yeah, I think you need to, yeah, now that it's
There
yellow,
we go.
hopefully.
All right. All right, perfect. Sorry about that. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about why the interpretive mode matters, where we can find texts, and what students can do with those texts, what tasks we can design to allow students to engage with them. So first of all, the definition of, a definition of interpret or of interpretation is to understand something as having a particular meaning or significance. So interpretation is really an active thing because it's not just listening, it's making sense of something. So you're trying to attach a particular meaning or significance to something. And I do want to take a moment to just address, to make a connection with everything that's happening in my country right now and around the world. I live in Vermont in the United States. And, you know, as all of us know, our country is in total turmoil in terms of what's happening with racial injustice, and a lot of people awakening to this for the first time and realizing that it's time to take massive action. And one of the first steps in all of this, you know, this is true for language acquisition.
Looks like we're having a little bit of bandwidth issues, so hopefully we'll have Martina back up with us shortly.
So thank you, everyone. I think that we have problem with the connection. So let's wait for Martina. And thank you for coming. I see people from Pakistan here, from Peru, and well, our colleagues in Indiana, our teachers in Indiana, and also from Pennsylvania, Oklahoma, Massachusetts.
I'm so sorry, guys. I don't know why this is having so much trouble today. I don't know when that cut off either.
So you had started to mention, you know, some of the turmoil happening here in the United States. And I think everybody at this point is familiar with having days where your internet just doesn't cooperate like you thought it would be.
Let's see. So my internet window is back, but I don't think you can see it. Sorry about that, guys.
Yeah, for those of us in the Midwest, I know parts of Indiana and Illinois, just if you had Comcast, we just completely lost internet for, what, like an hour yesterday?
So while Martina connects, just the quick announcement that I made, Dr. Stephen Krashen is going to be part of this series. Soon I will make the announcement through social media and Twitter, so wait for the date for Stephen Krashen. And then I see Martina. Yeah.
Hi, I am so sorry. I just switched my internet connection to something else, so hopefully that will help. Yeah, so one of these times that I got cut off, I was just making this connection that in anything, including in language acquisition, interpretation is really the first step. And so if you are, whether you're new or not to learning about racial injustice and what people of color face in our country, the first thing to do is to listen, and not to listen passively, but to listen actively, and to try to understand something to figure out what meaning and significance does it have. And action is important. And even as you're taking action, to continue listening and interpreting. So I did just want to make that connection before we move on, because I know that that's weighing heavily on all of us right now. But as it relates to language acquisition, interpretation, the interpretive mode from ACTFL, this is taken from the ACTFL performance descriptors for language learners. And the interpretive mode is when learners are engaging in reading or listening. It is interpretation of what the author, speaker, producer wants the receiver of the message to understand. And I think that's really important to point out, because sometimes we think we understand what the speaker was saying, but this is what the goal is understanding what did the producer of the language actually intend for us to understand. And it is one-way communication with no recourse to the active negotiation of meaning with the writer, speaker, or producer. So to me, that means that you may be very well negotiating meaning in your head. You're trying to make sense of this language that you're receiving, but you're not engaging with the speaker in doing that. So there's no recourse to the source of input. It is all happening inside your head. Okay. Bill Van Patten and Alessandro Bonatti said in 2010 in one of their articles that input is indispensable to language acquisition. Language acquisition cannot happen absent of input. Input, you have to put language in if you want to get language out. And so as we are looking at shifting instruction from our classrooms, where we're striving to speak with our students in the target language, 90% plus, to virtual classrooms, we need to figure out how are we going to get language into their heads. And this is why input is so necessary. So this is a very simplified version of Bill Van Patten's input processing model. He checked this over for me to make sure it's an accurate representation, albeit simplified. So this is what is happening when our students are acquiring language. It all starts with input. This is why input is indispensable. Input is the first step. So students receive input through listening or reading. The forms contained in that input go into the listener or the receiver's head, the student's head, and the learner's brain attempts to process them. So it's receiving these messages and it's trying to process them. Well, what does that mean? What does processing mean? When our brains are trying to process the language that we receive, trying to get the form contained in that language meaning. So trying to make meaning of the language. Any forms that a learner's brain cannot link to meaning are dumped. So those are your little reddish orange arrows. If a learner receives language, cannot make sense of it, the language is dumped and it's useless. It has no meaning. It doesn't stick in their brain. It's worthless, wasted language. However, if the learner's brain is able to attach meaning to the forms contained within the language, that language is received as intake. And the intake is then applied to the developing mental representation of language in the learner's head. And that's actually the learner's version of the language as it exists in the real world inside their head. So in my head, I have a mental representation of English, and it's very complete. My English proficiency is very high. So I have tons of connections, tons of different forms contained in this web in my head. My mental representation of Spanish is quite complete, but not nearly as complete as my English. And my French mental representation of French is, well, it's emerging. There's a few connections in there. And then when a learner is trying to speak or to write, so when they're trying to produce output, they're drawing on that mental representation of language that's in their head. So if we want our students to be able to speak and to write, we need to get language into their heads. Language gets into their heads by hearing or reading messages and understanding or linking forms, creating meaning of those messages. So, I'm trying to click to the next slide. So although comprehension cannot guarantee acquisition, when a learner understands something, it doesn't guarantee that they're going to acquire it. If you understand a word I say, it doesn't mean that the learner is acquiring it. Acquisition cannot happen if comprehension doesn't occur, because that form has to be linked to meaning in order for it to be received as intake and applied to the mental representation of language. That's why it's so important that we use the tools that we have as our students are reading and listening to help them understand the messages that we're providing them with. So when we're thinking about distance learning, when we're thinking about the terrible possibility of returning to virtual classrooms in the fall, even part-time. And also when we're thinking of returning to your physical classrooms, you've got to plan the input. So how are you going to get language into students' heads so that they can create with it? Because that's why students are in our classes, right? They want to be able to speak the language, but they can't speak it if it's not in their heads first. So plan your input. Do you want it to be authentic or learner focused? So, you can, a lot of teachers prefer to expose their students to purely authentic input. They try to speak as authentically as they can. They share songs with their students. They have their students read authentic articles, infographics, all sorts of things like that. Other teachers use a mixture of authentic and learner-focused resources, so resources that were created for language learners in order to maximize the input processing that can happen as they're understanding. And I love authentic resources, but the majority of the resources that I used in my classes and in my curriculum are created for learners, especially, I should clarify that I taught Spanish 1 and 2. And so, you know, in those early levels, I was trying to maximize the processable input, make it possible for my students to understand the messages that they were receiving through the input. You've got to think, am I looking at synchronous or asynchronous? I always wonder if I'm saying that right. Synchronous or asynchronous instruction. So am I going to be able to provide my students with it, or are we going to be able to engage to some extent or not? Are they going to be doing this on their own time? Do I want my students to be reading or listening, or a combination of the two? Is this going to be a collective thing where we are all listening to something together or all reading something together? Or is this something that's going to be self-paced? They're going to be doing this on their own. And then is it going to be purely receptive, or do I want them to interact with the input in some way? So as they're trying to interpret it, do I want them to be completing some task? And in some cases that might bridge into the interpersonal mode. But usually, because especially with beginning learners, they have such limited language skills, even things like them saying yes or no, that isn't breaking into the interpersonal mode. It's interactive, but still interpretive. Oh gosh, that was just so many like interactive, interpersonal. Had to make sure I was saying the right thing. Before we move on, do you have any questions? I feel it's presenting webinars is so strange, guys. I feel like I get no feedback. So are you still alive out there?
Yes, we've had people, not too much chatter.
Okay.
Just, you know, one person kind of echoing again the importance of the cycle of input, intake, output, sorry. We do have a question from Joyce asking if the slides would be available after the presentation, if that's something that you would be.
Most of the slides will be available. There might be a few that I keep out, but most of them will be available for you guys. Yes.
Okay, and we have one more question that you might also potentially address in your presentation. Could you speak a little bit about the role of grammar as input?
Oh, yes. Well, that's, again, this is very hard to, in this format. So I'm going to guess what you're asking. And so the role of explicit grammar instruction. You know, when I was learning a language, I was under the impression that language existed in my head in like lists of words and then in rules organizing it. And so that was why when I first started teaching, you know, I taught my students vocabulary words, and I taught them grammar rules. But as it turns out, that isn't how language lives in our heads. It lives in our heads in mental as that web of language where words are connected to other words and to other forms. So you could think of it like in your head, the word tree is connected to forest, is connected to squirrel, is connected to runs, is connected to jumps, is connected to eats, is connected to ate. So all of these words and pieces of words are connected in this giant web of language in your head. And to my understanding, that the grammar, where that comes into play the best for students learning grammar rules, is with the monitor. And so the monitor is this function that we have that if students have time, if they produce language and then they have time to think about it and they know the rules, then they can kind of go back and edit and think about what they're saying. Sometimes you might notice if you're using, in particular, your second language, I notice it with myself. with Spanish, sometimes my monitor is acting really fast when I'm trying to create speech. I'm trying to plan ahead what I'm going to say, and I am thinking through words, but I need time to be able to do that, and I need to know the rule, and then you know, just have the aptitude to know when to apply the rules. So it's very limited in its role in language acquisition. And so for me, I don't believe that that's the best use of my class time. I'm not in the classroom anymore. I should say that I'm home and just working with teachers in a support role full time. But I just didn't think it was the best use of my time, because the much greater portion of language acquisition is receiving input. And I guess if you guys want to drop in the comments any kinds of input, what have you done since school shut down? What have you done to provide your students with input? So what resources have you used? And maybe what ways have you, what things have you done with it? I would love to hear some of those ideas. So the first thing is planning the input. So figuring out how you're going to provide your students with input, but then also thinking ahead, how am I going to help them process the input? Because input alone can just go in one ear, out the other. But if you're going to maximize that processable input, which is the input that a learner's brain can actually receive as intake, then we've got to do a little bit more. So one of the things, the biggest strategies is just asking questions. So, and this is something that you probably do to a lesser extent with people in your life. I know I do it with my kids to figure out, like, are they really understanding the message that I'm wanting them to understand? So I'll make a statement and then I'll ask a clarifying question. Like, I've got to think of, I'm trying to think of one that's not related to going to the bathroom, but I say, did you move the pinwheels in the garden? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, did you do that today? Did you pick them up and put them over there? Like, are you really understanding the question that I'm asking you? And we can do that with our students too. Simplifying sentences. So instead of saying big, long run-on sentences, breaking them down into the pieces of into individual pieces of information so that learners can process one thing at a time. That way they're not trying to process this big chunk of language and multiple chunks of information. Present your learners with one piece of information at a time. And then you can always bring it back together. So instead of saying, like, the big friendly dog went to the grocery store, you can say, there was a dog. He was a big dog. He was a friendly dog. There was a big friendly dog. He went to the store. He went to the grocery store. So you're breaking down your sentences into simple pieces of information so your students are just processing one thing at a time. And again, I always need to say that I'm always thinking about this from through my context, which was working with beginning language learners. And language acquisition is the same no matter where on the scale of proficiency you are. But obviously you're not going to be working with your advanced students and saying, there was a dog, there was a big dog. You know, their threshold is higher. Rephrasing things, linking meaning to L1. If your students have a shared first language, use it. You know, I used to think that English was the devil when it came to language teaching. And what I've come to believe is that it's a tool. It's our shared language. It's what we can use to communicate and to connect with each other, and to have hard conversations even before my students don't have the language ability to do that in the target language. So it allows us to keep moving forward on their language journeys, even though it's not in the target language. Sheltering vocabulary, so thinking strategically about what words you're choosing to use with your students and limiting them. So, you know, instead of saying, oh, this person is tall and this person is short. Well, maybe you want to introduce two new words, or maybe you could say this person is tall, this person is not tall. Another thing is that, you know, in all of my language teaching experiences, we were working from textbooks where the first half of the year in level 1 was spent focused on the days of the week, the months of the year, the colors, numbers, things that are really not that useful in real life. I mean, how much of our conversations, especially our important conversations, are focused around the days of the week. They come into play, sure, but the words that I really need to be able to communicate with other people are verbs. And you could look at Terry Waltz's list of verbs, the Super 7, verbs like has, wants, goes, does. Those are words that we use all the time, no matter what topic we're talking about. And so if we focus on using those words in conversation with our students, looking for texts that use those words, those are the words, that's the language that's going into our students' head, and that's going to be the language that they're able to draw on when it comes time to output. If all we're putting into our learners' heads is days of the week, months of the year, colors, numbers, that's all they're going to be able to draw on when it comes time to output. Let's see, do we have any anything you guys want to jump in on?
So there were a lot of different strategies that that teachers are using to kind of get input. So, you know, using Pear Deck to read easy books for them.
So there is a problem with Teresa.
Or
I saw.
movies and pictures, when students to engage. So yeah, lots of different examples.
Awesome. Well, I wanted to look first at some synchronous options. So some ways that we can get language into our students' heads when we are face-to-face with them and technology is working, which as it turns out is the biggest challenge of all. So we can tell our students stories and, oh gosh, I thought I had my whiteboard up here, but I don't. So I have, it's not one of the little lap boards. I have one that's a little bit bigger, but even if you have a little whiteboard, that would do the trick. I like to tell stories and just draw on a whiteboard while I'm telling them. And I can also, while I'm doing that, I can write words that I'm using in the target language, which for me is Spanish, and then writing English next, the English meaning next to them to support comprehension. My mom was here just the other night, and I was telling her, she just finished up Karen Rowan's beginner Spanish class from Fluency Fast, and she works with a crew of Guatemalan migrant workers on my family's farm in upstate New York. And so she's really wanting to learn Spanish. And so I told her a story from El Mundo en tus manos, which is, it means the world in your hands. It's a Spanish publication that Maris Hawkins and I and Nellie Hughes have been putting out for a few years now. And we publish news stories from the Spanish-speaking world. So I was telling my mom the story of this dad who lives in Spain who during the quarantine, he would go out, he would take out the garbage at his house every day wearing a different costume. So he was Olaf, he was Superman, he was all these different things. So I told my mom this story in Spanish, illustrating things on the board, and she was able to understand the whole thing, which was so fun. So you can tell your students stories. You can ask stories with them. And for those of you that have never heard that term before, asking a story is basically like co-creating a story. So, you know, it's something that you might have done with children in your life, or your parents might have done with you when you're like, oh, you know, if you're looking at a doll, it's like, oh, what is her name? And is she a princess or is she a firefighter? And where is she going? And what color dress is she wearing? So you're co-creating a story or a vignette with your students. And you can do that in synchronous teaching, just like you can do that in the classroom. Having a conversation with your students, it can be super hard, as you may have figured out. Having a conversation with anyone in a platform like this can be a big challenge because there's so much, there's delays, there's interruptions, you know, you're like talking over each other, it's awkward, you're all like watching yourselves on the camera. But you can have conversation. And I know someone in the comments already mentioned Pear Deck, but that's a tool that you can really use to facilitate conversation. And I am no Pear Deck expert, but you can use it for a ton of different things. And I put Rachel Lucas's Facebook group on here. She runs a Facebook group called Tech for World Language Teachers, and she is an incredible resource when it comes to Pear Deck and just about anything. She's done a ton of different webinars. And so she's a really good resource for you if you're wanting to learn more about this Pear Deck thing that I'm going to mention a few times in this presentation. Reading with your students, we did a live video in the Somos curriculum collaboration group a couple of weeks ago, looking at shared reading. So just like I have for you now, we had a slide projected and we were reading through it, and we had a few different strategies to try to engage students, because obviously when something's just presented on the screen, they can read it on their own. So how do you keep students reading and processing that input with you? Some of those things included using sound effects, asking questions while we were doing the reading. We had it hooked up with Pear Deck. And you can play games with your students, and that's a great source of input. And that is what we are going to do now. So hopefully you guys have, and if you don't, you have a piece of paper. It could be a big blank piece of paper like this, or it could be a little scrappity scrap of paper. I should make sure this really is the next slide. Oh, no, it's not. While you're getting that, you can go get that. Sorry, I wanted to show you. This was an option. This is one way that I did story asking. So this is basically a choose your own adventure story, if you're familiar with those, although you can't use the name choose your own adventure because it's trademarked. So create your own ending. I call it a story builder. But this is basically a little presentation that I created for my students. Not my students, for students using my curriculum. I'm not in the classroom anymore. That is a story with options built in. So you just click through it. The students have to decide, you know, Chris is a person. One day, Chris, is this person in a park, in an apartment, or in a restaurant? And they click. I have to click the right one because I didn't put all the slides in here. Chris is in the park with a dog or a magician or wizard. And so you can talk with your students like, oh, what do you pick? Like, how do we want to create this story together? I think I went with the dog. Okay. Chris and their dog sit on the grass or play with a ball. Oh, I don't know. What do you guys think? Did they sit on the grass, play with a dog? They sit on the grass. Oh no, there's a problem. What is it? There's another dog's poop is on the grass, or the grass is toxic. Ah! So you keep going. Story continues, and then eventually you get to the end, and magic music turns Chris into a robot, and then you can go back and create another story. So that was one way that I facilitated that collaborative story creation with students, because it can be really hard to get answers, to get suggestions like you might in class. And then helping students to process it by asking questions, remembering all of these techniques to make sure that as you're using the target language with your students, that they're understanding you. Before we play our game, which hopefully you guys have paper and a writing utensil by now. Teresa, are there any questions I need to answer real quick?
Somebody was curious what educate play is. Sorry, I'm not saying that word at all.
I don't know.
Okay, so that must have been another teacher then that mentioned that, and she was asking for clarification. Okay.
Well, but I'm excited to hear about it. Okay, so you guys are going to take your piece of paper or your little scrappity scrap. I'm ripping mine. And on your little scrap or on your big piece of paper, you're just going to draw a little grid, like a tic-tac-toe grid. So just kind of like the hashtag symbol, just really little like this. Okay, and when you've got it, just say got it in the comments. And then I'm going to show you a bank of answers. Here they are, and you are going
Lots
to
of got
write,
it.
Awesome. Okay. You are going to write one of these words in each of the sections. So you're going to end up writing 9 of these. So any 9, it doesn't matter what, don't think about it too much. It literally does not matter. So I'm just picking 9 of those things and I'm writing them in my 9 grids. No one's going to see this. Well, maybe that's not true. Maybe someone will see it. If you're like me, you're just picking the fastest ones to write. Oh, there. I think some of those were probably covered up. Now you should be able to see all of them. You might need to change your, I don't know if you can, if I change it or if you have to change it if my picture was covering up the thing.
No, I think your cursor was overall pretty good.
Okay. All right. So now I have a little filled up bingo board that looks like a filled up tic-tac-toe grid. So this is a mini bingo board. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to ask you some questions. And does anybody have a guess? Oh, well, it's kind of obvious. It's extremely obvious. Does anybody want to guess what story this is about? Anybody? I'm guessing that you're all saying Cinderella. Can't hear
Yeah,
you, but.
Couple Princesses, Cinderella. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so imagine that you had just told your students the story of Cinderella with all of its problematic gender stereotypes and everything. Or maybe you told a girl power version, whatever it was. Maybe you told it to your students while you had your little whiteboard and you were illustrating it. Maybe you found a children's picture book and you were telling them the story in the target language while you were showing students the pictures. Maybe you read the story or they had them read the story somewhere before class. But regardless, they have somehow gotten the story into their heads in the target language. And it helps that it was a familiar story so they could understand it. So now we're going to ask some questions about it. So you are going to be listening for the questions that correspond to your answers. So I'm going to ask a question, and if you think that one of your answers matches the question that I ask, then you can exit off. And if you're not sure, it's not a big deal because I will confirm it before we go on to the next question. So you don't have to be super confident. You could, if you wanted, just wait until I confirm the answer before you mark it off. So your goal, I have played this before where you have to get all 9. 9 really isn't that many, but we are short on time. So we're just going to do the first person to get a row of 3. So it could be a horizontal row, vertical row, diagonal row. So 3 in a row. The first person to get a 3 in a row and comment bingo in the comments, you have to type comment bingo in the comments, will win a free 1-year subscription to Garbanzo if you're a Spanish teacher. And if you're not a Spanish teacher, I will figure something else out for you. That helps you in class. So we are playing for real. So I'm going to ask a question and you are listening for the answer. If it is on your paper, you mark it off. What do Cinderella and Prince Charming do at the ball? If you think you know the answer, type it in the comments. Teresa, it might be helpful, I guess, if you're unmuted, so you can kind of narrate.
Yep, we've got lots of they dance.
Yes, they dance. Okay, so they dance. So if they dance, if you wrote that down on your paper, you can exit off. If not, then just wait for the next question. Now we could talk about this. Imagine we had done the reading in the target language, and then now imagine that we are playing totally in the target language. So I'm asking questions, you're giving answers. And I might ask follow-up questions. Like I might say, oh, did they dance? Were they at Cinderella's house when they danced, or did they dance at the castle? Oh yeah, they danced at the castle. So you have a conversation. So it's not just, I mean, it could be just straight questions and answers in the target language, but also we're looking at how can we turn this into communication. And you can say, oh, what have you been dancing to when you're home? I know we have like an 80s rock list that my family's been jamming out to while we've been home on during it's not quarantine. What is it? Stay at home. Okay, next question. Who has magic powers?
Say, who's the lightning fingers on the board? Fairy godmother,
Yes,
Lori.
the fairy godmother. Okay,
Oh,
so if you
and
had,
Patricia,
if you
good
had
job.
fairy godmother, then mark it off. I'm just going to go through this really quick. Oh, do you think she was how tall do you think she was? No, that's a dumb question. Don't ask that question. What turns into a carriage?
And Jeanne with pumpkin. Oh, and Catherine. My goodness, you guys are typing so fast. I can't even see who's first. Yes, pumpkin it is.
All right, way to go. Well, the big thing is that when someone says bingo, we've got to know who that was first.
Okay.
Okay. Does a pumpkin turn into a carriage, or does a carriage turn into a pumpkin? That's one of those kinds of processing questions that you can ask your students to make sure that they're interpreting, that they're receiving the message that you intended for them to receive. The mice are transformed into what? The mice are transformed
Oh, we've got a
into
bingo from Nikki.
Wait. All right. Well, I will
With
be checking
horses.
that. After that question, the mice are transformed into what? Or
yeah.
All right.
Nikki Hollis.
Who was that?
Nikki Hollis.
Nikki. Okay, cool. Okay, so Nikki, you can email me. It's info@comprehensibleclassroom.com. If you can't remember that, just find me somewhere and say, I won bingo, and I will make sure that you get your prize. So you just play for as long as you want. You can play until a bunch of students get the 9 squares, or you could play until all your questions are done. And then what I love about this game is that you can play it in live instruction, but if you have students that weren't with you live, you can still give them a chance to win. So your student that wins live, like, yay, great, you get all of the virtual hugs. But then for students that are not playing with you live, you can have them watch and listen to the game being played, and then just have them take a picture of their bingo board. And then when they're done, just have them give them a list of the questions and the answers, and have them write down what were the 3 questions that corresponded to 3 of your bingo answers. So like in this one, I always point to the screen like you can see what I'm pointing at. So in this one, it was blue, 6, and yellow, and those were the things that the person marked off. So they wrote down the 3 questions that corresponded to it. So in this case, Nikki, to get full credit for her win, she would have to write down the questions: what do Cinderella and Prince Charming do at the ball? Who has magic powers? And the mice are transformed into what? So if you need accountability, if you need students to have some kind of a task to show that they engaged, a photo is good. Again, help students process the input while you're playing that game. So ask questions, simplify sentences, rephrase things, personalize, so connect them to your students' lives. All of those things are not only going to help students process the input, which is needed to get it into their heads, but also it's going to create more conversation as you're doing it. So you're going to be creating more language that can get into their heads as you're talking about whatever you're working with. Okay, so those were some of our synchronous options: storytelling, story asking, conversation. We played a game. Again, connect with Rachel Lucas in Tech for World Language Teachers. She has awesome ideas for using technology in synchronous classes. Here are some asynchronous options. And I want to put a disclaimer ahead of time that all of these examples are either in Spanish or French. However, some of them are also available in other languages. And I am working to create a resource list for teachers of other languages, other than Spanish or French, so that you know what's available to you for asynchronous interpretation. So Garbanzo is my website. We launched it a year ago this month. And it is basically an online interactive library of short readings. And we have, I think, 600 different texts in Spanish on Garbanzo about all sorts of things. Some of them are stories, some of them are familiar stories, some are original stories. We have a ton of nonfiction texts, and students read these texts slide by slide, so small chunks of information at a time. And there are processing questions that are built in to help them understand what they're reading. So these questions are not included to quiz students and to see, like, are they really understanding? It's to help them understand. So in the same way that you reading with your students in class might be asking those processing questions, we're trying to mimic that with Garbanzo. Fluency Matters has a lot of books available as e-courses. You can read their books. I'm looking to see if I have any of their physical books right here. They have physical books that you can purchase for your students, but in e-learning formats. Students can read it. It's an online flip book. It's really neat. And they can listen to it while they're reading it. So there's audio that goes along with the text, so they can listen and read at the same time. They definitely have French and Spanish, and I believe they have a couple other books available as e-courses. And every e-course comes with tons of activities. So if you want your students to be completing tasks in conjunction about the text, those are all embedded, and there's a learning management system for you to track what your students are doing. Alicia Quintero has tons of resources on her blog. This was one that she just released recently, so I wanted to include this. She's written quite a few books, but she also has a lot of short stories available, and some of them have been translated into French as well. Oh, I had Garbanzo on there again. This was a project that I had. This is Revista Literal, is a free online magazine that I wrote this, well, I just ended the publication for this year. But students can write stories and they can submit them, and we'll publish student stories. So students submit stories, all of the errors, as messy as they are, we will take them. We have a team of volunteers that edits them, both for language errors and then also to help them make a little bit more sense in terms of plot. And then we'll add images and we publish them on the website. I'm working on getting, on helping somebody get a French version going. And if you teach another language and would like to do this, I would love to support you in that. It's a lot of work, but so worth it because it is a library, it's a totally free library of stories that have been written by other students. And I think you probably all have students who this would just totally make their day if they were published on a website like this. And I think the Spanish version, we get like between 3,000 and 5,000 views of each story every day. So your students can like pretend like they're famous. It's really fun. El Mundo en tus manos, this is our news publication. We just wrapped up for this past school year, but we'll be publishing again in the coming year. We publish news stories every 2 weeks. Maris Hawkins and I, from the Spanish-speaking world, we publish them in a few different levels. So this is the most simple level where each story is just a paragraph. And then we also publish an extended version of each story. And when school shut down, we moved into a digital format where students could read the PDFs, but then they were completing tasks. We had some reading activities that were all done through Google Docs and Google Slides. There's a French version as well that's published by Cécile Linné and Anna Gilcher. And so here's an example of Le Petit Journal Francophone. This is a free issue, but they have a subscription that's ready for the coming year as well. And again, if you teach another language and that sounds really appealing to you and you'd like to start a project like that, I would love to support you in getting it started. Senor Woolley, of course, has Spanish and French resources, and there's tons of things for students to complete online that can be done on their own from home. Alice Ayel is amazing, and she teaches French. She has a YouTube channel, but she also runs full courses, and so she would be a great person to connect your students with. A lot of teachers have created distance learning units. Here are some from the Somos curriculum. We are working on getting these out. Well, we kind of took a break this last couple of weeks, but we'll be working on getting more out for the coming year. but basically where students through Google Docs, Google Slides can be reading and listening and completing tasks to engage with it. One other teacher that has shared units like that is Berta Delgadillo, and this is her website. She's got a lot of online resources that she has shared in the last couple months. And then Sarah Breckley does Spanish videos on YouTube. And again, I do want to just apologize and acknowledge that that was mostly Spanish and French. And I know that you have a ton of different languages here. And I would love to support you and to help you find those resources that are going to be useful for your languages. I'm sure you have some ideas already, but I would love to help you connect with those. Do we have questions?
We had some teachers who were sharing some other ideas or resources, particularly in French. So we have a question from Caitlin about Revista Literal. Are young native speakers able to submit to it?
Oh, yes, absolutely. We have gotten a ton of submissions from heritage speakers of Spanish and native speakers of Spanish. Often what we'll do, we will publish their story in the original format, you know, maybe correcting a few little grammar things here and there. But we'll also, the team of volunteers will create a simplified version of it as well, so that students can read it in sequence, and that supports language learners in understanding that rich language. And that has been a really cool thing that we've been able to do through that. So yes, absolutely. And we are pretty much out of time. So should I jump to questions?
Yeah, I think we can go ahead and do questions. We had a question about El Mundo and Tus Manos. Is that a subscription that renews every year?
You have to get a new subscription every year. So right now, I mean, you could purchase the old subscription, but I mean, the articles are a little bit, I mean, they're out of date now. So I would purchase for the coming school year. Mm-hmm. These are some examples of activities that we include. This is in Google Docs. So students are answering questions about the text. But what I wanted to notice, to show you about this, these are either or questions. So again, as you're creating, as you're designing tasks for your students to complete, interpretive tasks from home especially, there are 5 bazillion ways for students to cheat. Like they can use Google Translate. They can, you know, hold up their phone and look at this. They can, you know, use translation services both ways. So either like putting in what they are trying to read, but then also putting in what they're trying to say. So you want to design tasks that are intended to support students in understanding the text, not to quiz them in their understanding, because you're not going to get an accurate read really as to whether or not they understood it. It's going to be very hard for you to do that because there's so many cheats. So instead, think about your tasks as supporting your students. What do my students need what can I do to help them to understand this? And in this case, I used processing questions, yes or no questions, or either or questions about the text to help them think about what they're reading. And they're easy questions, so the incentive to cheat is very low because they're not hard. You know, most of the time students are going to turn to a translator when the effort is greater than, when it would be easier for them to do that than to just answer the question. But if it's easier for them to answer the question than to like take the time to type it in Google Docs, then that's what they'll do. Okay. Ed Puzzle too. I want to mention Ed Puzzle. That's a great task thing. So anytime you have a video for students, like if you're using Sarah Breckley's videos or any authentic video, this is one that I love. Ed Puzzle is an amazing tool, and you can learn more about that with Rachel Lucas in the Tech for World Language Teachers. We're not going to play strip bingo. I know you're so sad. All right, so some questions. And thank you to the sponsors of this. You said IFLTA, is that what? I just been saying IFLTA. So thank you, IFLTA and Indiana Language Roadmap and the, oh, I've got to uncover this, Hamilton Lugar, the School of Global and International Studies. So questions that you have.
We have a question from Kimberly. So she hasn't really done much interpretive reading with her students after moving online because she doesn't want them reading from a screen and spending a lot of time on the screen.
Oh my gosh, I know.
Yeah. So what suggestions do you have to try to reduce your students' screen time?
That's a great question. And unfortunately, I don't have good answers, because if they're going to be reading, it's either on a screen or it's something that they have in their hands. And how are they going to get something in their hands but you giving it to them, or otherwise procuring it? So, you know, as you're looking ahead to the fall and this possibility, I know some schools, a lot of schools printed out copies of all of the things that they were going to be using. Obviously, that's a massive use of paper, but it's something that you can do, is be looking for resources that you can print. But I would be making a plan now for how can I get books in my students' hands this fall. So can I write oh gosh, like a proposal for my administrator? Can I order some books now and get that in the works? Is there, like, you know, a lot of us hate to do DonorsChoose for classroom supplies and begging family and friends, but, you know, is that something that you could do? Could you set up a DonorsChoose and see if it can get funded over the summer so that you can have a copy of a book for every one of your students?
Let's see, we have Patricia sharing with her colleagues about, I'm going to butcher the name again, Educaplay, to kind of clarify some of the different things available.
Making a note of that.
Yeah, Deb really appreciates all of the different great blogs and resources you just shared, and is looking forward to some summer reading. Lots of folks saying thank you. I'm looking for other questions. Let's see, I know one question that we had a little bit back in the way was, so you mentioned how for authentic materials, it can be particularly challenging when you're working with beginning students to kind of prepare those. Do you have any kind of tips or best practices for those who want to use authentic materials in the classroom with beginning learners?
Yeah, so whenever I'm thinking about an authentic text and my students trying to interpret it, I think about how I'm going to scaffold it. So it's never just a one-off. I shouldn't say never say never. It's typically not just a one-off activity. It's something that we're working with it for a while. So, I have like a little catchy thing that I say, but I'm probably not going to remember what it is right now. But it's a 3-step process where you are, it's 3 I's, but first you are essentially preparing your students for it. So you're thinking, what do I need to pre-teach? So do I need to pre-teach them about this topic? Are there particular words that they're going to need to understand this infographic or whatever this resource is? And if so, how can I get those words in my students' heads so that when they see them, they'll be able to understand them? Then I usually give them some kind of an interactive, it's introduce. So you introduce the topic or you introduce the vocabulary, then interact. So then students interact with the resource in some way. And that's where you might do like a closed listening. So students are listening to song lyrics and they're filling in the missing words from a transcript of the lyrics. That's an interactive task. Or maybe they're listening to a video and they're putting the pieces of the video in order, in the order that they're shared. That's an interpretive task, which there's a pretty easy way to do that with Google Slides that you can get from my blog. I have a blog post about that recently. And then follow up. So then you're going to investigate. So after students have interacted with it, then we're going to talk about it. So it's input heavy on the front and on the back end. So you're figuring out, how am I going to get language into my student's head? They do a quick interactive activity. And then at the end, we're going to investigate. We're going to dig into this topic further. We're going to look for connections. And that is all happening in the target language. So that's more language getting into students' heads.
Well, Martina, thank you very much for this